Welcome to this lecture in the series on violence in the American South, and this one relates to lynching and is an accompaniment to the other lecture on lynching in this series. And this looks particularly at a primary source. Now, when we study lynching, it's a phenomenon which, in a lot of ways, sought to cover its own tracks. It was really about removing an individual from society was seen to have transgressed boundaries or violated the social order or whatever. And as we see, particularly in the article by Don Matthews, and sort of putting it in the broader perspective of religion and sort of systems of symbols and ideas of segregation and purity and so forth, lynching was about erasing and removing people. And it also tended to be something that did a reasonably good job of erasing and effacing the traces of itself in the historical record. So very often we have very brief coroner's reports which simply say this person was killed at the hands of parties unknown to the jury. And that's often where the investigation ends. Not in all cases, but in a lot of cases. So we don't tend to have a lot of detailed court records that tell us a lot about what happened with lynchings. We have not necessarily lots of memoirs and journals and correspondence of people who were directly involved and so forth. What we mainly have are newspaper articles. There are problems with newspaper articles as sources, and I made quite an extensive argument in one of the chapters, I think it's chapter 5, of my book called This Mob Will Surely Take My Life, about a lynching of a man named Richard Puckett in Laurens County, South Carolina in 1913. And I argue there that the key newspaper articles that tell us what happened in that actually are entire fabrications. And I have a somewhat complex, elaborate argument for why I think that's the case. So in some ways, we can't entirely trust newspaper articles, but for the most part, they're the main thing that we have to go on when we look for sources that tell us about lynchings. Now, what I have here, and I need to scroll back up to the top of it here, what I have here is an article not about a lynching, but about a lynching that didn't happen. And it didn't happen, it seems pretty clear, because African American men in the neighborhood made sure that it didn't happen by taking their guns, going to the jail, and protecting the man inside who was considered to be at risk of being lynched. This is an article from the Macon Telegraph of the 12th of June, 1892, and I think that's useful to bear in mind for a few different reasons. 1892 is the year where there were more lynchings than any other year, and Georgia being a very large state with a large African American population, lots of lynchings happened in Georgia in all different years, and particularly in 1892. So in a way, and Macon, I should say, is a sort of medium-sized city, small city in sort of central Georgia. Look it up on the map, you'll see what I mean. So in a lot of ways, this episode, this event, or sort of non-event, is right at the center of the phenomenon of lynching, geographically, chronologically, and so forth. And yet, there wasn't a lynching in Macon, Georgia in June of 1892. And the events recounted in this article go a long way to sort of explaining why that was the case and why that didn't happen, I think. So, at the beginning, it points out that a group of African American men came to the jail for the last 2 or 3 nights bearing arms to protect a man who had been arrested for murder who was in the jail. And it says that several of them, it's not really clear how many, but some of them were arrested by the police. And this editorial or this article is sort of a response to that. So I think the first point to make is, was this really necessary? Was it necessary to turn up to the jail with guns to protect the guy who was inside? The newspaper writer says Well, of course that's not necessary. If such danger of mob violence really existed, it would be the officers of the law who protected against it, and they would have acted promptly and effectively in such a case. Well, obviously that wasn't universally the case because there were lots and lots of lynchings. Sometimes people were lynched by a mob before they were ever arrested, when they were suspected of doing something, or maybe had done something, but before they even came into contact with law officers. In other cases, they were arrested and were seized by a mob on the way to the jail, but in quite a lot of cases, people were arrested, committed to jail, and then seized from the jail by a mob when they overpowered, and sometimes there wasn't a whole lot of resistance from the officers of the law. To be fair, in a lot of cases there was resistance from sheriffs and jailers and so forth. And in a few rare cases, you actually have sheriffs, particularly because they tended to be the sort of central figure here, actually firing on mobs, and in some cases shooting people that they knew in the mob to carry out their duty to protect their prisoner and just make people respect the rule of law. But your chances were not really that good of getting like the one good sheriff in Georgia who would lay his life on the line and shoot his neighbor to protect you if you were suspected or possibly had committed a crime. So what the author of this newspaper article suggests here is that the most the private citizen can do, all that he should do, is to use his personal influence in creating a public sentiment that will demand a rigid respect for the law and to cheerfully aid in enforcing it when called upon by the proper authorities. So what he seems to be suggesting here is that African Americans in Georgia in 1892 should talk sensibly and calmly to a mob of white people who were threatening to pull this young African American guy who's been arrested for murder, pull him out of the jail and hang him, shoot him, or burn him alive. That these African American men who thought that wasn't such a great idea should reason with these people and say, please take account of my position in society and the respect that you hold for me, and consider your actions and maybe don't do this. It's not a very realistic, probably a very successful way of preventing a lynching. It's also rather cynical, I would say, to think that law operated in Georgia with that sort of equality and even-handedness, despite whatever the race of the people involved was. And I think the other thing that's quite interesting about this is that in this chapter, or not chapter, sorry, in this paragraph, that the writer is sort of saying these African American men, they shouldn't have brought guns, they shouldn't have congregated in that way, they should have used their personal influence to try to change public sentiment and get people to respect the law and so forth. What he doesn't talk about is the really obvious thing that, seems to be what actually happened is there was a guy who was arrested for murder, black guy. There was a white mob that was threatening lynching. And so a group of black men brought guns to the jail and, openly or maybe subtly said, if you try to storm the jail and lynch this guy, we have several people here with guns and we will shoot you. We won't necessarily get all of you, but we will get some of you, and it might be you. It's interesting that the newspaper writer doesn't actually say anything about violence, right? It's almost as though he doesn't want to talk about the possibility of African Americans resisting white violence with violence. I think there's a parallel to be drawn here to something written by the great Haitian historian Michel Rolfe-Trouillot in a very, very good book that he wrote called Silencing the Past, which is about sort of power and the production of history and the things that get forgotten and left out of history. And in that book, he's talking about the Haitian Revolution and the people who are observing it and commenting about it and writing about it, the people who are creating the on-the-spot primary sources that historians will use later, and explaining that these white observers, they simply couldn't get their heads around the idea that a population of enslaved black people could rise up, that they would want to rise up, that they did rise up, that they could defeat European armies and establish and maintain their independence in the institution of slavery. The white observers, writing letters and making records and so forth, they just couldn't understand it. It was, to use Trouillot's phrase, unthinkable as it happened. And I think there's something similar here in white Southerners trying to imagine the possibility that African Americans might defend themselves violently against white violence. They could certainly imagine white violence. They didn't have to imagine it. They could observe it. They talked about it a lot. They justified it and so forth. But the idea that that violence by white people against black people in the South might in turn be met by violence is something that it's a bit trickier to get their head around, and also, possibly a bit dangerous to discuss. It could give African Americans the idea that violent resistance could indeed be successful, as it does seem to be in this case, because there wasn't a lynching in Macon, Georgia in June of 1892, nor 1992 as far as I know. So if we look at this next section, an exhibition of race feeling on one side is apt to provoke a similar and more violent display of it on the other, and it is for this reason mainly that we deprecate the course of the colored men in gathering at the jail. So what the author is saying here is that the very hint of a violent response by African Americans to the wildly illegal actions of a mob trying to lynch somebody, that the possibility of violence, even turning up with guns, was itself very likely to provoke white violence against them. And in this case, I think the newspaper writer is very accurate. There are many, many cases where any resistance, however mild or, doesn't have to be really strong resistance or lethal resistance, but any resistance by African Americans to white violence often led to an intensification of that violence. And we see this in many cases where lynchings had their roots in an argument or a disagreement over business or some sort of just a small insult, and any kind of resistance from an African American in that situation was likely to bring down much greater violence by the person they were resisting and also other white people who thought that their authority and their sort of monopoly on violence was being challenged. And we sometimes see one lynching happening and then African Americans complaining about it, and then more violence against other people. That was the case in the lynching in Statesboro, Georgia in 1904, for instance. But in this case, I think the African Americans who go to that jail with their guns, they know very well that they're risking a much bigger, much more dangerous confrontation that could envelop not just them, but their neighbors at home, their wives and children, everybody. It could become one of these sort of widespread racial massacres that occur in the South. But they also think we're going to risk it to try to save this guy. And it's a very fine balance to be struck, but they obviously got it right in this case. Of course, the next thing that the newspaper writer says, their action may be interpreted as a threat, and threats at this juncture are as dangerous as they are useless. Well, dangerous, yes. Useless? Not really, because it worked. There was no lynching. I think these sorts of events, right? These lynchings that didn't happen, the dog that didn't bark, are harder to find in the historical record than the lynchings themselves, because the original set of records that we have of lynchings that happened tended to be kept by people who were trying to stop lynching, and they were much more interested in documenting things that happened to take action against and to sort of publicize the nature and scope of the problem than they were in talking about the things that didn't happen. However, when you start digging through and just trawling through patiently the newspaper archives of the American South, you do find quite a number of episodes like this where it looks very likely that there will be a lynching, and then something happens and there's not. And in a number of cases, it is actually resistance by local African Americans in one form or another, and not unusually, it's the threat of armed resistance. But it's a very dangerous business, of course. So I hope this has been interesting and somewhat useful, and I hope it just suggests to you again that there's such a wealth of information about this period in newspapers, and particularly as you look towards dissertations next year, I would strongly encourage you, if you have an interest in this period, to avail yourself of the really vast newspaper resources that are available.